Be me, Kayla, HR manager at a mid-sized tech company. Been doing this for almost 5 years now, 29 years old. The kind of person who sends articles about unconscious bias to the whole team distribution list and genuinely expects people to read them. Not sorry about that. I got into HR because I believed the field had actual power to change things, not just the administrative side of it, not just managing conflict and making sure nobody got fired in a way that created legal exposure. The real structural stuff. Who gets hired? Who gets promoted? Who gets taken seriously in a room? Who gets interrupted before they finish a sentence? Who gets the benefit of the doubt when a project goes sideways versus who gets pulled into a meeting to explain themselves? That stuff is real and has always mattered to me more than most of my colleagues seemed comfortable with. LinkedIn is basically where I live professionally. I built my following carefully over a few years. Posting consistently, engaging with research, sharing articles that challenge the standard way companies talk about culture and fairness. Somewhere around 4,000 followers by the time this whole thing started. I worked for that number. I didn't just add everyone I met at a conference or accept every request that came in. The posts I put up focused on hiring equity, the distance between what companies claim their values are and what their actual practices look like, why diversity initiatives keep failing when they're not backed by anything structural. I wasn't loud in the way that gets you dismissed or blocked as an extremist. I tried to be specific, to cite things, to make arguments that even skeptical people would have to actually engage with, rather than just wave off. My coworkers knew this about me. Travis, who sits a couple of desks over, is the quietest person in our office. He does his work, drinks an alarming amount of coffee, and occasionally says something so dry and accurate that the whole room goes quiet for a second. He described me once to a new hire as the person who would find a way to bring up the gender pay gap in a meeting about office snack budgets. I heard about that secondhand, and I laughed. He was not wrong. I'm not going to pretend I was an easy colleague in every situation, but I was honest. I backed up what I said, and I think that counted for something, even with the people who quietly rolled their eyes whenever I started talking. Anyway, this whole thing started on a completely ordinary evening. I was at home on my couch doing that thing where you're scrolling on your phone because you're not quite ready to put it down, even though you've already seen everything worth seeing twice. I ended up reading an article in my LinkedIn feed about gender bias in professional networking. Not hiring in the traditional sense, more specific than that. The article was specifically about how men and women with equivalent credentials get treated differently on networking platforms from the very first contact. More recruiter outreach going to men, more senior-level connections being initiated, more follow-through and persistence from headhunters when the profile has a male name attached to it. I had read variations of this argument many times before. There's a long body of research on resume audits where identical resumes go out with different names, and you measure callback rates. That literature is solid, and the results are consistent. But this article was about sustained behavior over time, not one-off application responses. The argument was that the compounding effect of small daily differences in how platforms and their users engage with male versus female profiles results in men building richer professional pipelines over months and years. I read it twice, and then I had a thought that was so clear and specific it almost felt like it arrived from outside me. What if I just did this myself? Not with fake resumes sent to a sample of companies. A real profile, maintained for real, based on my actual credentials. I know my own background better than anyone. 5 years in HR, 2 promotions, solid record across talent acquisition and culture initiatives, recognized within my company as someone who actually delivers. I know how recruiters talk to me, what kinds of messages I receive, what assumptions get baked into the outreach, even when it's professional and well-intentioned. What if I built a male version of me and ran both profiles in parallel for 90 days and just watched what happened. No interference, no manipulation, just observation. I grabbed my laptop before I could think my way out of it. The setup took a couple of hours. The profile name was Chad Mitchell. I picked that specifically because it sounded like a completely normal professional name. Nothing unusual, nothing memorable, just the kind of name that belongs on a business card and doesn't make you do a double take. For the photo, I used a stock image, a man in a navy blazer with a neutral background, the kind of headshot that looks like it was taken by the company photographer on a Tuesday. Everything else on the profile was me. Same job title, same seniority level, same years of experience, same listed skills, same industry, same city. I mirrored my own summary section very closely, just shifted the phrasing so it didn't read as a word-for-word copy, adjusted a few word choices to sound natural for a male-presenting professional. The substance was identical. When I finished and looked at the completed profile, I felt a genuine sense of having created something real. Chad Mitchell looked like a person who actually existed, who had spent 5 years building a legitimate career in HR and talent operations. I stared at it for a while. Then I opened my notes app and started writing the outline for the post I was going to write at the end of this. I already had the title before a single data point existed. 90-Day LinkedIn Experiment. Proof that men get it easier. The structure was clear in my head already. Set up the experiment, describe methodology, present the data, draw the conclusion. The conclusion was already written in my mind before the experiment started. I should have noticed that. I genuinely should have. The next morning, I told my friend about the whole thing over coffee before work. She was immediately enthusiastic, the way she gets about things that feel like they're going to be satisfying. She said something like, "This is so good. You're going to have actual documentation. Nobody can argue with your own first-hand data." And that framing felt completely right to me at the time. Documentation, a record, something grounded in direct experience, rather than studies conducted by other researchers on other populations. I left that coffee feeling like I had done something smart. Travis found out about it almost right away. It was maybe day 2 or 3 of running the experiment. I was at my desk adjusting some privacy settings on Chad's profile, making sure the options were configured the way I wanted. He walked past on the way to the kitchen, glanced at my screen without stopping, kept going. Came back a few minutes later with his coffee, stood near my desk for a moment. I explained what I was doing before he could even ask, laid out the whole thing, the 90-day timeline, the parallel profiles, the spreadsheet I was setting up to track contacts and outreach. He listened the whole time without interrupting, which is just how he is. When I finished, he asked one question. "What are you expecting to find?" I told him exactly what I expected. More recruiter attention going to Chad, higher quality outreach, more senior-level contacts being initiated, more follow-through from headhunters over time. He said, "Interesting." Just that word, flat and even. In the tone where you genuinely cannot tell if he thinks it's a brilliant plan or the dumbest thing he's heard this week. Then he went back to his desk. I set up the spreadsheet that same week. I wanted to do this properly. Columns for date, which profile received the contact, what type of contact it was, the seniority and industry of the person reaching out, whether the role mentioned remote or on-site arrangements, salary range when listed, specific role demands that stood out in the description, and whether I responded. I was going to be thorough and neutral about the logging, no selecting for the data points that supported the conclusion I already had. Everything in order as it came in. The first 2 weeks were honestly a little boring. Chad's profile got almost nothing. A few profile views that looked like they came from broad regional searches, one generic connection request from an account that appeared to be connecting with everyone in a certain geography. My own profile got the usual kind of traffic I always receive. a recruiter message about a mid-level role I wasn't interested in, a couple of connection requests from people in adjacent HR-adjacent fields, a comment on something I had recently posted. Nothing dramatic on either side. I logged it all and kept reminding myself that new profiles take time to get picked up by whatever signals the platform uses to surface them to recruiters. The algorithm needs time to understand what a profile is. Week 1 and 2 were going to look quiet no matter what. I had to be patient, which I was, mostly. Though I will admit the silence was slightly anticlimactic compared to how I had pictured the experiment playing out. Sometime around the 3rd week, the activity started picking up on Chad's side. I watched it develop over a few days and felt that small flicker of, here we go. Connection requests coming in at a higher rate than before, a couple of in-mail messages from what looked like actual human recruiters rather than automated systems. I opened each one carefully and started going through the profiles of who was reaching out, and that's when I had to actually stop and think. The recruiters contacting Chad were overwhelmingly from industries I had never worked in and had no interest in working in. Heavy logistics, oil and gas field operations, large-scale commercial construction, industrial manufacturing, legitimate companies, professional outreach, real roles, but sectors that had nothing to do with my actual career or the direction I had ever wanted to go. I noted all of it in the spreadsheet and moved on. I told myself the industry distribution was a separate variable from the question of bias. The experiment was about volume and the quality of opportunity, not which specific sectors were generating the contact. My own profile was also receiving messages in that same period. From tech companies, from healthcare administration organizations, from education-adjacent nonprofits, from startups whose descriptions mentioned things like flexible culture and results-oriented environment. The industries that had always been my professional home, the industries where I had built relationships and reputation, and where the work actually connected to what I cared about. I logged it all and kept going. Around the 4th week, there was a message for Chad that was specific and direct enough to make me actually sit up at my desk. A recruiter from a well-known staffing firm reaching out about an operations management position. It wasn't a blast to everyone who matched a keyword search. It was addressed specifically, referenced details from the experience section of Chad's profile. Real company, real role, clearly written by a human who had spent more than 30 seconds on the profile. The salary range mentioned in the posting was noticeably higher than what I currently earned. I remember sitting there with that for a moment. Here was something that looked like exactly what the experiment was supposed to surface. Concrete financial advantage, going to the male profile from a credible professional source. Then I clicked through to the actual job description and read it all the way through. Required travel was listed as up to 60% of the time. The role involved direct management of a warehouse operations team spread across 3 separate sites in different cities. The language about physical presence was not hedged. The posting said explicitly that the right candidate needed to be comfortable working in a physical environment and managing teams in the field across locations. On-call availability was mentioned once in the core description and a second time in the requirements list near the bottom. I closed the tab. I logged it in the spreadsheet. I did not write any note next to the entry, just the facts in the columns. My own profile around the same time received an inquiry about a remote HR strategy consulting engagement. Good company, interesting scope. The description used the phrase work from anywhere and mentioned regular check-ins rather than required presence. I logged that one too, put them both in the spreadsheet side by side without any annotation. Travis asked how the experiment was going at some point around then. I was in the kitchen refilling my water bottle, and he came in to get his 3rd or 4th coffee of the morning. He asked it the way you ask about a project you remember exists, but aren't tracking closely. I said I was still in the data collection phase. He asked if I was finding what I expected. I said it was too early to draw conclusions. He filled his cup and walked out. I thought about that exchange for the rest of the day, which was maybe more than it warranted. Something about the phrasing, finding what you expected, rather than what did you find. As if the two things were the same question with different words. I was probably reading into it. Travis does not usually mean complicated things by what he says. But I kept coming back to it anyway. The next couple of weeks, I started doing something that hadn't been part of the original plan. When Chad received a message, I would go and read the full job description all the way to the end, not just check the headline details and close the tab. All of it. The requirements, the expectations, the schedule language, the reporting structure, the scope of accountability. I was building up a picture of what these opportunities actually looked like on the inside, and the picture had a pattern. The roles coming to Chad were characterized by what I started calling friction in my own notes. More physical presence required, longer or less predictable hours, direct accountability for large teams or operations with real consequences if things went wrong. The kind of roles where the upside was genuine, but so was the downside. High ceiling, high floor. My own outreach was structured differently. Advisory positions, support functions, roles where the reasonable worst-case scenario was a difficult conversation or a delayed timeline rather than a failed operation or a public incident. I kept logging everything and trying to stay neutral about what it meant. Somewhere in the 6th or 7th week, I received what felt like the clearest single data point of the whole experiment. Chad got an in-mail from a senior recruiter at a firm I actually recognized, one with a real reputation in the talent space. They were filling a director-level opening at a company I knew had decent culture and legitimate backing. I felt a genuine jolt of excitement when I opened it. This was it. This was the type of thing I had been waiting to see. A serious seniority level, a credible source, going directly to the male profile. I saved the message and opened the job posting. Director of People Operations. The team was 40 people, direct and indirect reports combined. The description said the person in this role would serve as the final decision maker on all people-related matters at the company, including investigations, separations, compensation adjustments, and executive-level hiring. Performance would be evaluated on a quarterly basis against retention rates, time to hire benchmarks, and headcount growth targets. Availability during peak hiring cycles was expected to extend into evenings, and the posting described peak periods as roughly 6 months of the year. On-call responsibility for employee relations incidents was listed as a standard expectation in the role. The salary range at the bottom was higher than anything that had come to my profile across the entire experiment. I sat there looking at that number for a while. Then I opened my own inbox and looked at what had arrived recently on my profile. A part-time consulting engagement with a nonprofit doing workforce development. A mid-level HR business partner position at a company that had specifically listed their flexible scheduling policy in the job description. An invitation to participate in a regional professional association's diversity in hiring committee. Volunteer basis, quarterly meetings. I put all of it in the spreadsheet. No annotations, no flagging, just the data in the columns. I went home that evening, and the uncomfortable thought that had been forming and dissolving and reforming for a few weeks finally stayed long enough for me to actually sit with it. What if the gap I was measuring wasn't men being handed better things? What if it was men being handed things with different conditions attached? Conditions that most people would hesitate to accept once they read all the way to the bottom of the description. The director role, paying more than I made, also required me to be reachable at any hour when an employee had an incident, to be on point for 6 months of late evenings, to be the person whose name was attached to every major people decision the company made. The consulting role with the nonprofit came with flexibility and limited scope, and a much lower ceiling on both compensation and consequence. I did not like sitting with that thought. It disrupted something in the structure of the argument I had been building. The argument had a shape I was comfortable with, and this thought was asking me to change the shape. Travis walked past my desk the next morning while I was staring at the spreadsheet with nothing happening on it. He asked if everything was okay. I said yes, just working through some numbers. He looked at the screen for about 2 seconds, which for Travis is a long look, and then kept walking. He didn't say anything. I kept going. I said 90 days, and I was going to do 90 days. Around the 8th and 9th week, the spreadsheet had grown long enough that I started running through it with a different eye. More than 40 contacts logged across both profiles, and the pattern was not breaking in any direction I could explain away. Chad's entries were consistently heavy on compensation, heavy on travel, heavy on physical or operational accountability, heavy on the kind of responsibility that doesn't turn off at 5 o'clock. My entries were consistently lighter in all those dimensions, and heavier on flexibility, on advisory scope, on the kind of professional engagement that fit the way I actually wanted to work. There was one more thing I had started tracking that I hadn't originally planned as its own column. A meaningful portion of the messages coming to my own profile were not entirely professional in register, not inappropriate in a way that would constitute a formal complaint, but not purely about the job either. Messages that opened with a comment on my photo before getting to anything about my qualifications. Messages that felt like they were doing social work before professional work. Chad did not get those messages, not one. Every single message Chad received was about the role, the qualifications, the opening, direct, impersonal, entirely about the opportunity. I logged it in its own column. But when I looked at that column alongside everything else I had accumulated, I found myself genuinely uncertain how to frame it. Yes, there was noise in my professional inbox that didn't exist in Chad's, but was being treated with complete impersonal directness, purely as a bundle of credentials and nothing else, actually the better experience? Or was that itself a kind of flattening that came with its own costs? I kept turning that over without landing anywhere clean. Sometime in those middle weeks, I also opened a separate document and did something I hadn't planned on doing. I wrote out the 5 most substantive outreach contacts Chad had received, and the 5 most substantive ones that had come to my profile, wrote them out as plain descriptions without the column headers telling me which profile received which. Just 10 job descriptions in plain language. Then I read through them and asked myself which 5 I would actually want if I were making a real career decision today. Not which ones sounded more impressive in the abstract, which ones I would actually accept. I would have taken 2 of Chad's 5 and all 5 of mine. I sat with that for a long time. I didn't write it in the spreadsheet. I closed the document. Travis asked me sometime around then how many weeks were left. I counted on my fingers and said about 3. He nodded, said something like, "Interesting timing," and went back to his desk. I still don't know if that meant anything, or if he was just filling the silence. The last stretch of the experiment felt different from the beginning. At the start, I had been watching both profiles the way you watch something you expect to perform on cue, impatient, scanning for confirmation. By the end, I was watching more carefully and with a kind of attention that was less about confirming and more about actually trying to understand. Chad kept receiving outreach. The recruiter about the logistics director role followed up a second time, then a third. Persistent in the way that suggested whoever was sourcing for that role genuinely thought the profile was a strong match. Another message came in about a field operations management position in a different state, similar conditions to the others. My profile kept receiving its own traffic. A follow-up from the company that had initially reached out about the consulting role wanting to know if I had availability to discuss further. An invitation to speak at a virtual HR conference panel. On day 89, I opened the draft post that I had been adding to since the first week. It was long by that point. I had been writing into it regularly as the experiment progressed, adding specific examples as they came in, fleshing out the arguments section by section. The core structure was still intact. Male profile, higher level outreach, financial gap, documented over 90 days, evidence of systemic bias in professional networking. The writing was clear, the examples were real, the post would have been publishable. But every time I tried to write the conclusion, the final paragraph with the call to action and the summary of what this all meant, I stopped. Not because I ran out of words, because the conclusion I kept trying to write did not match the data I had actually collected. The data supported something more complicated, something that didn't fit inside the title I had written before the experiment started. I looked at the draft for a long time. I didn't publish it. I didn't delete it either. I just closed the laptop and went to bed. Day 90, I sat down and opened LinkedIn, went directly to Chad Mitchell's profile, looked at it the way you look at something you put real time and attention into and are not sure what it amounts to. The connections accumulated over 3 months, the messages sitting in the inbox, the recruiter who had followed up 3 separate times about the logistics role. I thought about what it would actually mean to publish the results. Not the clean version with the clean conclusion, the version that reflected what I had actually found. That version would require me to say, on my professional account with 4,000 followers, that the experiment did not produce the result I expected. That the advantages I documented for the male profile came bundled with conditions I would not have accepted. That the outreach I received on my own profile reflected assumptions about what I wanted and how I wanted to work that were, in some cases, not wrong. That the picture is more complicated than the title I wrote in advance. I was not ready to say those things in public. I deleted Chad Mitchell's profile. No post, no thread, no reference to having run an experiment. Just close the account and close the tab. The draft post is still sitting in my drafts folder. I have not opened it since the night before day 90. The following Monday, at the weekly team meeting, I went through open roles and hiring pipeline updates and a couple of process questions from managers. Nobody asked about the experiment. There was no reason they would. Most of them never knew it existed. Except Travis. After the meeting ended and people were collecting their things, he came up beside me while I was gathering my notebook. Quiet enough that nobody else heard. Asked me whether I got what I was looking for. I said, not exactly. He nodded once. Didn't ask what I actually found. Didn't offer any reaction to the outcome. No satisfaction. No, I told you so. Nothing that would have given me something to respond to. Just the one nod. And then he went back to his desk. I thought about that exchange more than I expected to. A reaction, even an annoying one, would have given me something to push against. The nod just left everything sitting there in the open. I still post on LinkedIn. Same topics, same focus, same issues I have cared about since before this experiment existed. I put up something about hiring bias not long after I deleted the profile, and it got normal engagement, nothing unusual. Chad Mitchell has not appeared in anything I have written since. Not a reference, not a mention, not even a vague post about the value of testing your own assumptions. And I keep telling myself that's because the data wasn't clean enough to be useful publicly, which is partially true. 90 days, one industry, one market, one person's profile running in one city. That's not a study you can build a strong public argument on. But it's not the only reason. The other reason is that saying what I actually found would require me to complicate something I have been saying for years, and I'm not sure how to do that without the complication being taken as something it isn't. The framing around toxic masculinity in professional environments is real to me. I have experienced it directly. I have watched it operate on colleagues. I have seen it show up in performance reviews, and in who gets interrupted, and in who gets assumed to be junior until proven otherwise. None of that dissolved because of 3 months of watching 2 LinkedIn profiles. But I also found something I wasn't looking for: that the structure pressing on men looks different from the inside than it does from the outside. That what registers as professional advantage from a distance can look, up close, like a set of demands that nobody would freely choose if they had the option. That the version of treatment that seems like respect when you don't have it comes with its own costs when you do. I don't have a way to say both of those things simultaneously without one of them pulling the other apart, and I am not ready to figure out how to do that in public. So for now, I keep posting. And the draft just sits there, and Chad is gone. And Travis drinks his coffee and doesn't ask. I want to add one more thing because I keep thinking about it. There was a specific week, probably somewhere around week 7 or 8, when I started paying attention to how Chad's outreach was written versus how mine was written. Not the content of the opportunities, which I had been tracking from the start. The actual language of the messages, the way recruiters chose to open, what they emphasized, what they assumed about the person they were writing to. Messages to Chad were almost always efficient. They opened with the role, stated the qualifications match, asked for availability to discuss. Sometimes they included a note about why they thought the experience was relevant, but it was always about the work, always about what the person had done and whether it fit what was needed. The messages had a professional shorthand to them, like the recruiter was writing to someone who they assumed had limited time and wanted direct information. My messages had a different register. There was often more warmth in the opening, more scene setting about the company culture and why it was a great place to work, more language that felt like it was managing the experience of receiving the message as much as conveying the information in it. Sometimes a compliment about the way I had framed something on my profile. At first, I logged it and moved on, but then I sat with it and tried to figure out what I actually thought about it. Because on the surface, the warmer messages are nicer to receive. But what does it mean that someone assumes you need to be warmed up before you'll engage with a professional opportunity? What does it mean that the default assumption about a male profile is that you want the facts, and the default assumption about a female profile is that you need the experience curated for you? Is that consideration, or is that a form of not quite taking you at full face value as a professional? I genuinely did not know where to land on that. I still don't entirely know, but it went in the spreadsheet. Another thing I noticed, and I debated logging this because it felt more subjective, was the follow-up behavior. When a recruiter messaged Chad and didn't get a response, a meaningful number of them followed up, sometimes twice. The assumption behind that follow-up was basically that the person was busy, that the message might have gotten buried, that the opportunity was worth another reach. When recruiters messaged me and I didn't respond, the follow-up rate was lower. Not dramatically lower, but noticeable when I looked at the column. I spent time trying to figure out what that meant. The straightforward reading is that men's silence gets interpreted as busy, while women's silence gets interpreted as not interested, which would fit the standard story about professional bias. But there was another possible reading I kept running into. The roles Chad was being followed up about were the high-friction ones, the ones with travel requirements and operational accountability. Maybe the persistence reflected how hard those roles were to fill. Maybe it wasn't about gender at all and was about the fact that roles with difficult conditions require more sourcing effort because fewer people accept them. I logged it and did not reach a conclusion. There were several things I logged and did not reach a conclusion about. The spreadsheet got longer and the annotations stayed blank. Sometime in the middle of all this, I had a conversation with my friend that I have been thinking about since. She asked me how the experiment was going, and I said I was finding some things I hadn't expected. She immediately wanted to know if I was finding more or less bias than I thought, and I said it's not really that simple. She pushed a little, said something like, "But in general, is the hypothesis holding up?" And I said, honestly, I wasn't sure. She got quiet for a second, and then said, "Well, don't let them gaslight you into thinking it doesn't exist." And I understood what she meant. I understood the instinct behind it. But the thing is, nobody was gaslighting me. I was the one running the experiment. I was the only one with access to the data. Whatever the data was showing me was not being filtered through anyone else's interpretation. I was doing this to myself, which is its own kind of uncomfortable thing to realize. After that conversation, I went back to the spreadsheet with fresh eyes, and I tried to look at it as if I were a stranger who had no prior hypothesis. A person who had just been handed this data set and asked to describe what it showed. And what it showed was not a clean story in either direction. There were real differences in how the two profiles were treated. The differences were measurable and consistent. But the shape of the differences resisted the simple reading I had arrived ready to give them. Chad got more outreach in certain categories, yes. The outreach he got came with conditions that I cataloged and found difficult to frame as uncomplicated advantages. My outreach came with conditions that fit my actual preferences and working style. There was bias operating in the system somewhere. I was fairly sure of that. But it was not operating only in one direction, and it was not operating only to benefit one side. It was pressing on everyone, just with different textures. That was the thing I kept trying to get to the bottom of and kept not quite landing. The toxic masculinity piece was real in my experience. The structural expectations placed on men were also real. And the two things were not as separate as the argument I had been building assumed them to be. I don't have a clean ending to offer. The experiment ended, the profile got deleted, the draft stayed unpublished. I go to work, I do my job, I care about the same things I cared about before all of this. But I am carrying around a spreadsheet worth of data that I have never talked about publicly, and a title I wrote before I knew what I was going to find, and a nod from Travis that I think about more than I should. One more thing that I think matters. Somewhere in the last 2 weeks, I started noticing something about how the experiment had affected how I thought about the male colleagues around me. Not Travis specifically, just in general. I had gone into this with a fairly settled mental model of what professional life looked like for a man in my field. More doors opening, fewer people questioning whether you belong in the room, better shot at the top roles. And I still think there's truth in that model. But I also started seeing the other side of it. The recruiter who followed up 3 times on Chad for the logistics director role. The assumption baked into every single one of those messages that the person reading them was okay with 60% travel and on-call responsibility and final accountability for everything. The complete absence of any language checking whether those conditions worked or whether there was flexibility. Just the assumption that this was what you signed up for when you presented as a professional man in that sector. And I thought about what it would feel like to spend a career receiving those messages. To have the professional world around you assume, consistently and without asking, that your time is fully available and your preferences don't need to be checked, that you are there to perform the function and the conditions are not really a negotiation. I had always framed the flexibility and consideration in my own outreach as something women had to fight for. And in some contexts, that's true. I know it's true. But I also started seeing it as something that men were rarely offered in the first place. Not because the world was being generous to women and stingy with men, but because different assumptions were being made about what each group wanted and what each group was for. None of that makes the bias I've documented in other contexts disappear. I want to be clear about that. I have seen women get passed over for promotions they deserved watched men get the benefit of the doubt in situations where the same behavior from a woman would have ended the conversation differently. I have dealt with people who held my opinions to a different standard than they held the same opinions from a male colleague. That's real, and I'm not walking any of it back. But I walked into this experiment thinking the story had one shape, and I found something with a different shape. And I haven't figured out what to do with that yet, so the draft stays in the drafts folder, and Chad stays deleted. And every time I open a new post about hiring equity, I know there's a 90-day spreadsheet sitting in a folder on my desktop that I never reference. I'm not sure if that makes me honest or a coward, probably some of both.